is still very broken up. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, yes we can.
Okay. All right. Well then, given that, I think the logical thing is to start with me presenting the PowerPoint that you've got there. This is a paper that I gave to the, I think the last of the Animal Management conferences back in about 2006 or 2007. It presents the material that you see in that paper. So if I go through that, hopefully it doesn't take too long, then that'll form the basis for any further discussion and questions and so forth. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm operating it from
fine, okay. Now, all right, so to the jury, Emily asked me to give you, to provide a little CV, which I haven't done. So briefly, I'm a veterinarian in Canberra. I've been a small animal, or initially mixed, but then small animal veterinarian for the last 33 years. I have a practice in Canberra that's now a fair size, and that's kind of precluded me continuing with some of the work that you're seeing here. Back in, I think it was 98 to, probably 95 to 2002, I was a member of, and then for 7 years, the chair of the Animal Welfare Advisory Committee of the ACT. And in that time, we basically rewrote the companion animals legislation in the ACT, and I chaired the subcommittee that did that. So the relevance of the work that I'm doing here, or that I'm presenting here, is not only that it represents the results of the mandatory desexing legislation, but that I chaired the committee that introduced that legislation. And from your point of view, it's valuable to know that based on this research, my opinion about the value of mandatory desexing legislation has changed. Clearly I was in favour of it when I was chairing the relevant committees, and now I think that it's less likely to be of value, but that depends on your circumstances. So here we go. This research was done, and it's just purely crunching of numbers, 6 years after the introduction of compulsory or mandatory desexing legislation in the ACT. The ACT, as you all know, is a small territory nestled in the middle of New South Wales. There's I think now we're up to about 380,000 people or something like that, and most of them are urban people living in the city of Canberra. Some relevance that we have a higher standard of education than the rest of Australia. That has implications for the impact of education campaigns and so forth that the government or other bodies may introduce into our community. But the level of pet ownership is pretty much the same as other parts of the ACT. Relevant to this work is that or at least at the time that this work was done, there were really only two places that stray animals went to in the ACT. RSPCA cats and small numbers of birds and rabbits and guinea pigs and octopus and donkey and things like that as well. And of course it took care of wild animal species. And Domestic Animal Services, which is the ACT government service, and that's only for dogs. So that means that stray dogs, or stray dogs in the ACT are likely to go to two places, but cats only to one place. Subsequent to this time, there have been, like everywhere else, a rise in the number of rescue organisations, and we have various interactions with these organisations. So some of them will take animals out of the pound and foster them and try to rehome them and so forth. But there wasn't that going on at the time that this work was done. So in the revised Domestic Animals Act 2000, we made the desexing of dogs and cats mandatory by 6 months of age. They had to keep them intact. The implementation date was the 1st of June 2001. So if you move on to slide 5, the first of the graphs, the first few graphs look at dogs, and what these graphs show is, first of all, in the middle you can see a purpley coloured box that says MDL 6/01, and that's attached to a dotted line, and that dotted line is meant to indicate the introduction of mandatory desexing, the time when it became mandatory for people to have their pets desexed by 6 months of age. The yellow line, it's a little bit misleading in the labelling, it shows the intake of dogs, and when you get to the cat graphs, the intake of cats per 1,000 people in the ACT. So the idea was to try to find a relevant medium. If the population of the ACT was going up, you'd expect the number of animals entering the shelter to go up in proportion to that, and so this gave us a sort of a benchmarking number. And given that the graph shows the intakes of dogs in the ACT, it's not very surprising that the bar graphs and the yellow graph match up here. And as you can see, it shows that from 2000 there was a fall in the number of dogs that entered the RSPs to the ACT. I apologise, I should have introduced this by saying that when I approached these two organisations for data, the RSPCA willingly shared their data with me. The Domestic Animal Services, the Government Pound, promised to share its data, but I never received it. So we don't have any data from the Pound. This is just RSPCA data, but it does reflect all the cats and a very substantial number of the dogs that were entered into pounds and shelters in the ACT. So, was there a change in the number of dogs entering the RSPCA shelter after the time of the introduction of mandatory desexing legislation? Well, yes, it appears according to this graph that there was a small reduction in the number of dogs entering the shelter. The next graph shows animals shows dogs, I beg your pardon, who were returned to their owners subsequent to entering the RSPCA shelter, and you can see that there appears to be an increase in the number of dogs who found their way back to their owners after the introduction of mandatory desexing legislation. I think that it's hard to draw a conclusion that this was directly a result of the mandatory desexing legislation. One can argue that people who choose to have their animals desexed are demonstrating a high level of commitment to their animal and therefore want to get it back. Maybe that's the relevance here, but as some notes later in the presentation will show, the RSPCA and perhaps the community through the government were making increasing efforts in this period to encourage responsible pet ownership, and so it's a little difficult to say for sure that this increase in returned dogs was definitely associated with the introduction of mandatory desexing. The next graph, slide number 7, shows animals who were adopted. In other words, they found a new home to go to from the RSPCA. And you can see that this graph shows that from the year 2000, there was a steady decline in the number of animals who found new homes after having entered the RSPCA shelter, the number of dogs who found new homes. And one could argue that appears to follow the introduction of mandatory desexing legislation, but if you can think of a reason why there would be a reduction in adoptions, particularly associated with mandatory desexing, you're a better man than me, or woman than me. The only reason would be clearly if there was a massive increase in the number of animals who were returned to their homes. We did see that on the graph. How do those things relate to the mandatory desexing? A bit hard to say. I think that it's more likely that this was going to happen anyway, but you can argue that point, of course. Now, one of the key things that everybody wants to see is a reduction in the number of euthanasias occurring in shelters. Slide 8, the slide that's titled Euthanasias of Dogs, shows that indeed there has been a reduction in the number of dogs euthanized in the RSPCA shelter in the ACT, but the fall in numbers appears to come from about 1998, so several years before the introduction of mandatory desexing legislation. And if you look at those bar graphs, you can see that the number of euthanasias was relatively steady after the introduction of mandatory desexing. Perhaps it went down from the period beforehand, but it didn't continue to fall. Has the introduction of mandatory desexing caused a progressive decline in the number of euthanasias? No, I don't think we can draw that conclusion at all. We go on to next. Right, the next graph brings us to cats. So this is slide number 9. So in the same sequence, the first slide shows the intake of cats into the RSPCA shelter, And in the middle of the slide, you can see the introduction of mandatory desexing legislation. And here you can see that there is no clear and obvious decrease in the number of cats entering the shelter as a consequence of mandatory desexing. There was a clear fall from 1998 to 2001, or perhaps to 2003, but that then started to increase again heading towards 2006, which is clearly the end of the data that I have, and I haven't looked at the numbers since then. I wish I could have done, but I haven't done, I'm sorry. So if intake into shelters is a principal reason for introducing mandatory desexing legislation, then I think you can conclude that mandatory desexing made no difference to the intake of cats into RSPCA shelters. And if I can go on and say that at the moment, the RSPCA this year has been tell us that they are swamped with animals, swamped with cats, I should say. That they just can't cope with the number of cats who are coming in. Then I think you can presume that mandatory desexing by itself hasn't achieved its goal of reducing the intake of cats into the RSPCA shelter. Return cats going back to their owners, well, like dogs, you can see that in the 2000s, you can argue that perhaps there was a bit of an increase in the number of cats, or proportion of cats who are returned to their owners. It looks like that graph's kind of going up a bit. I don't know whether that continues afterwards. We've got a little bit of information to discuss about that later on. Next graph, number 11, shows cats who found new homes, cats who were adopted by new owners out of the shelter. This is another sort of key indicator that you'd like to see the number of adoptees going up, and perhaps there's a trend from 2003 to 2006 showing an increased number of cats being adopted, but godly, there's not much change across the whole of the graph is there. That you can't argue that there's been any change associated with mandatory desexing there. Slide 12, the next graph shows euthanasias of cats. Again, one of the really key things, everybody wants the number of animals euthanized in pounds and shelters to go down, and you can see that in the ACT, over the time period of this graph, the peak number of euthanasias occurred in 1998. There was then a fall, and that fall preceded by several years the introduction of mandatory desexing legislation, and indeed after mandatory desexing was introduced, most of the subsequent years show a higher level of euthanasias compared to the period immediately preceding it. So has mandatory desexing reduced the number of euthanasias of cats in the RSPCA ACT? No, it hasn't. It hasn't done that at all, I'm afraid. The next graph, number 13, shows the number of, or I beg your pardon, the percentage of cats euthanized compared to the intake of cats. So if your intake goes up and your euthanasias go up, then the percentage, of course, is going to stay much the same because it's presumably the same proportion of euthanasias to intake. And if there was a success in our animal policy in relation to, or as a result of mandatory desexing, then you'd hope that the proportion of euthanasias might go down. Obviously, you hope the intake would go down, but you'd hope that maybe the euthanasias would go down as well. And I think you can see that across the spread of the graph there's not been a great change. The peak again was in 1998, the highest proportion of euthanasias compared to intake. Not a big surprise given the previous graph that we saw, and not much change in those numbers across the rest of the period. Then we've got a few slides showing the relationship between what happened in the ACT and in New South Wales, which is the jurisdiction surrounding us, and in the rest of Australia. So slide 14 shows these figures all relate to the intake of cats per 1,000 of population, and the introduction of mandatory desexing once again is this vertical purple line there. So you can see if you look at the blue graph, the blue line, which is the intake of cats per 1,000 population for the whole of Australia, that it's relatively flat, isn't it? It went down a bit from 95, 96 to about 2000, 2001, 2002, and then slightly went up again. And the same thing was true for New South Wales, the red line there, that the numbers went down to about 2001, 2002, and then started to climb. And golly, it kind of looks like that's what happened in the ACT as well. So the changes that occurred in the ACT, rather than saying that they're a consequence of banded desexing, look like they kind of reflect what was happening in the rest of Australia as well, and the rest of in our surrounding jurisdictions of New South Wales. The next graph, slide 15, is the same data, but looking at the numbers euthanized, cats euthanized per 1,000 population, and because of the much smaller numbers, the graph for the ACT peaks and troughs much more dramatically. It's more levelled out across the larger population groups of Australia and New South Wales, but you can see that there was a significant decrease in the number of euthanasias leading up to about 2001, 2002, 2003, but well and truly preceding the introduction of banded desexing. And in the last few years of data that we show, you can see that proportion of or number of cats euthanized, unfortunately, has started to rise again. So, can you draw a conclusion from this that banded desexing was good for us? I don't think you can, unfortunately. Go through the rest of the presentation just for the sake of completeness. The next slide, slide 16, is showing dog population trends in Australia up to the year 2005. This is data that was published in the Australian Veterinary Journal in about, 2007, something like that. And as you can see, there appears to be a decline in the number of dogs owned by people in Australia, at least from a peak in 2001 down to 2005. The text underneath says that the percentage of pet dogs desexed was about 75% for females and about nearly 60% for males. And the data that I hope you guys have looked at, that was published in the American Journal of Veterinary Research, showed that in order to achieve a zero population growth of dogs, you had to have something between 66 and 77% of female dogs having been desexed. Now, this Australian data shows that we already had about 75% of female dogs desexed. Hence, it's not surprising that we would have no population growth or a decline in pet-owned dogs in Australia. Why is this relevant? Well, if we increase the proportion of dogs who've been desexed, then overall we're likely to have a smaller number of dogs owned in Australia. But if the number of dogs owned has been going down and the number of dogs entering shelters hasn't changed all that much, is that really going to help us very much? Maybe the data needs to be analysed a bit more before you draw conclusions about that, but it's worthy of some consideration. Slide 17 shows population data and future estimates for cats, and most of you will be aware that the cat population in Australia, owned cat population in Australia, is in significant decline, or at least was as of the last data that I've seen. I haven't seen particularly recent data about this. And the same information is presented then about ZPG, zero population growth. And the same team from America calculated that something between 76 and 88% of female cats, pet cats, had to be desexed to achieve zero population growth. Now, definitions have to be looked at here. I suspect that they're talking about zero population growth of the owned cat population. We'll come to the reasons for saying that shortly. But the information presented in the paper that showed this population trend showed that about 94% of owned cats in Australia, female cats, were already desexed. In other words, significantly more than the number required to achieve zero population growth. So once again, it isn't a big surprise that the number of owned cats in Australia is in decline because we have this large number of desexed cats already. Don't mistake me. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing that all these cats are desexed. Sometimes the fingers being pointed at the veterinary profession saying, you guys don't want to desex cats because it'll take away your business and so forth. Well, equally think we've had the finger pointed at us in the past saying, you just want to desex more cats because it'll give you more money. Well, neither of those things are true. We're interested in taking care of owned cats and giving them the best quality of life, and we're also interested in what happens to the rest of the cat population, and we're certainly concerned about cats and dogs entering shelters. And what we're trying to do, of course, is to find scientifically validated means of achieving some worthwhile goals in this area. Now, up to slide 18. The next thing I want to look at is what were the reasons for animals entering shelters and animals being euthanized in the RSPCA. Specifically, this slide talks about animals being euthanized, and it comes from the end of the data period, and Michael Linke was then the CEO of the RSPCA ACT, and his quote is, "In 2006, no cat or dog was euthanized as a result of overpopulation in the shelter. The main reasons for cat euthanasia were 40% of them because they were feral and 33% for health-related reasons. And in relation to dogs, temperament and again health were the primary reasons for euthanasia. But once again, no dog or cat was euthanized because of overpopulation. That certainly hadn't been the case in previous years, but in 2006, the last period that I have data for and have information to present to you, that was the case in the ACT. So it seemed then that the RSPCA was doing a pretty damn good job of finding homes for all dogs and cats who were suited by virtue of their temperament and their health to go to new homes, to live as companion animals. Michael made the point then, which I completely agree with, that the RSPCA provided a service to the community by preventing animals, particularly with temperament problems, from going back into new homes. Other data that I'm not going to talk about here shows pretty clearly, and I trust you guys are well aware of it, that there's a high return rate of dogs and cats who've been adopted, that go back into shelters or get abandoned by their new owners. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that, but in many, many cases it's because of the behaviour problems manifested by those animals. And so working to present animals whose temperament and behaviour patterns will enable them to live for the rest of their lives in a home and in the community is clearly a really important thing for the welfare of the animal as well as for the new owners and for the community itself. Of course, there's lots of ways of dealing with behaviour problems. What I'm saying is that making sure that only the ones who are truly suitable go to new homes is a really important part of the pattern here. Finally, in 2006, there was such a demand for cats from the RSPCA that they actually imported some from Townsville, and I believe there's been a fair movement of particularly cats and some dogs from rural shelters that the RSPCA have to urban shelters in order to satisfy demand, in some years at least. So there's a busy graph or a busy chart on slide 19, again analysing the reasons for euthanasia of animals in the RSPCA. If you look at the column marked canine, you can see that if we go to that middle box there, percentage of animals euthanized under the canine column, just over 60%, nearly 61% of dogs were euthanized for behaviour reasons and 37% for health reasons. If you look at the column for cats, the one which is adjacent to it, oh, I'm sorry, I beg your pardon, the feline column, the one at the end, you can see that behaviour problems led to euthanasia of 21% of cats, health for 40% and cats who were deemed to be feral for another 40%. So the behaviour ones were cats who were presumed to be owned cats originally by their temperament and behaviour, but where their behaviour was deemed to be unsuitable for them to enter a new home. The feral cats were the ones who were clearly deemed to be feral at the time of admission. There was a presumption based upon their behaviour patterns that they had never had contact with humans and were clearly going to be unsuitable to be rehomed. And if you add up the percentage of cats euthanized because of behaviour problems and because they were feral, it comes out to something over 60%. The percentage of dogs euthanized for behaviour problems is 72%. Where have I got that from? It's a while since I've looked at these numbers. Not quite sure where the 72% comes from, but the logic was anyway that very high proportions of dogs and cats in pounds and shelters get euthanized because of behaviour problems. If you go to slide 20, we talk about that there. Over 60% of euthanasias of dogs for behaviour problems, something over 7% of the intake in total. Cats, that's better to look at the bottom number, where 60.5% of euthanasias were for behaviour reasons, and because they were feral cats, about 25% of the intake of cats fall into that category. And I think that's really relevant because the mandatory desexing legislation is clearly not going to address behaviour of dogs, and for reasons that we'll look at in just a second, I think it's not going to address the behaviour of cats or the number of feral cats out there, and so it's not going to change these very large numbers of euthanasias occurring in pounds and shelters. So, looking at slide 21, talking about dogs, the point about this, I guess, is to say that dogs and cats are clearly very different when we look at the reasons why they enter shelters and the way we have to address their management to try to reduce the numbers that are unwanted and get euthanized. In relation to dogs, well, essentially there are no free-living dogs, at least not in the ACT, and I'm presuming that that's the case elsewhere as well. That's clearly very different to cats, and as you well recognise, and we'll go on to that in a moment. Why do we see behaviour problems? Well, genetics clearly plays a role. So poor breeding practice, choosing to breed from animals, whether they're purebred or crossbred, whose temperament is not going to lead to the production of puppies who have good temperaments as well. Poor selection of pets to go into the home. As a vet, we regularly see people who choose a Kelpie, a delightful working dog, but then expect it to be a very quiet, peaceable, well-mannered animal in the home, but give it little training and little exercise and little mental stimulation, and so the dog barks and is destructive and escapes and does all sorts of things that lead to the people being unable to keep it, for example. Lack of socialisation, the thing that we've all been harping on for 20 years, that young puppies and kittens need to be brought up in such a way that they are content to be in the company of people and other members of their own species, and to be easy and a pleasure to own in that way, and a lack of basic training clearly as well. Now, all of these...
Michael, we've probably got about another 5 minutes because we've got other speakers coming in.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't realise we had it.
That's all right.
Okay, all right. So I'll get on let you do some questions in just a flash. The next slide just says the fact that cats are clearly different, that large numbers of them are coming into shelters not having been surrendered by people who can't cope with them. There are certainly some like that, but large numbers of truly feral cats who get trapped and brought in, and large numbers of free-living cats, stray and colony cats, or semi-owned cats as some of the papers call them. And we have to address those populations of cats differently. I'll let you guys look at what's in the papers about, I think it's in there, you might, or later on you might want to have a look at slide 25, which looks at some data from Victoria, where they estimated the numbers of registered, semi-owned and feral cats. Perhaps you should just look at slide 25 quickly.
Yeah, got it.
The point about this is to say, if mandatory desexing was 100% successful, what difference would it make to the percentage of desexed cats in the population? So at the time, in 2005, Victoria estimated that in total, about 37.5% of their cats were desexed. If mandatory desexing was 100% successful, it would only affect the registered cats, the cats that people claim to be their own. And so if you look at then the percentage on the right-hand side, the impact of 100% successful mandatory desexing is likely to bring the proportion of desexed cats from 35.5% to just under 40%. It's clearly not going to make much difference to the number of kittens born overall. So mandatory desexing by itself is not going to have much impact on the number of unowned cats and so forth. I might leave it at that. There's a few more slides with some recommendations. You guys can look at that in your own time, but if you've got a few minutes at least to ask any questions that have come up.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Michael. And we'll provide the jury